Time for the long-awaited talk. Let's please welcome Professor Bilal Baki on stage and listen to him. Thank you.
Mr. Umar Rahman, Vice Chancellor IUB, Mr. Tauheed Samad, Chairman of the Board of the Chittagong Wing of IUB, dear friends, always a pleasure to be here. I've been coming and going Dhaka regularly, and I always try to come and connect with IUB and essentially share the experience of Singapore with IUB. I've been giving talks on many subjects: curriculum reform, strategic planning for NUS, how we launch our new programs, integrated science program, many things. So I want to put on record that I really appreciate being here, seeing IUB grow from small buildings in Baridhar to this magnificent building here. I mean, a testament to the leadership of IUB. So wonderful, great work. Glad to be part of it. I would like to thank also my friend Dr. Zahoor Ahmed for helping me prepare this presentation, because when I showed it to him, he said, this is not going to get across. You have to restructure it. So I did a major restructuring. The other thing I want to request you is please be patient, because you won't hear this talk. I mean, it's rare occasion you'll hear talk like this. So there's lots of things here that I can spend hours on, or I can spend 5 minutes, depending on your patience. So, once you get on board, it's really a fascinating world that you're going to enter. So before I go any further, I would like to also record something. Mr. Tauheed Samad has actually pointed this out. Last time I was here, I did integrated science. I'll come back to this book, but I want to recall the memory of two great scientists and scholars who were there at that meeting in 2010. Professor Bazlul Mubin Chaudhry chaired that session. And there was also in the audience a mentor of mine, a lifelong mentor of mine, Professor Jamal Nazrul Islam, who graced the occasion, and it was a great honor for me that they were there. Today they're not with us, but their memories will remain with us forever. So in their memory, I would like to dedicate this, this talk today. Ironically, Mr. Tauheed Samad, quoted from Professor Shi Chun Fong, the intuitive, instinctive approach to science. And in this book, for example, we ask questions which are obvious, like, why is the sky dark at night? No, not because sun is not burning, that's wrong. It's because the life of the universe is finite. Completely counterintuitive answer. We ask questions like, why is the leaf green? How can you smell perfume in a room where there's no apparent movement of air? Why can you stretch rubber? And so on and so forth. Okay, so when we wrote the book, we said, of course this is intuitive science, but the deepest science is way beyond physical intuition. It's completely based on your mathematical knowledge of nature and the completely counterintuitive engagement with the invisible dimensions which are in reality, which you can never see, ever. And they're the foundation of what exists here. So we thought, well, we can't shortchange our audience. We need to write a second book. The second book is a sequel to this book. This book is intuitive. What is sunlight? Things like that. This book, far more complex. So let me continue with this book. So is there an invisible domain that cannot be seen? The materialists, of course, say no. You see what you get. Now, in religion and philosophy, they have another domain. And here's the great Buddha meditating. Apparently, he must be in the other domain. He looks like he's gone from this domain. So, according to the religious philosophers and thinkers, there is another domain, which is great. Modern science also agrees with that, but completely disagrees on the methodology of engaging with the other domain. So what is the difference? What is the method that differentiates these two? Sorry. It's a scientific method. I quote from the great Richard Feynman. Those who know about him know he's one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. And he says the following in his book: experiment, and experiment alone, is the sole criteria of scientific truth, full stop. That's it. No experiment, forget it. You can do great mathematics, that's fine. That's not science. You have to connect your mathematical structure or your theoretical structure with observations carried out by experimental equipment. Now, what is an experimental equipment? What does it mean to carry out an experiment? Is a vast subject in and of itself. So what is an experiment? But intuitively, it's a device outside human consciousness. The device independent of human consciousness. We don't want human consciousness to be part of the experiment. There's too much subjectivity there. That's experiment. We all can agree. To give an interesting observation, my co-author and my collaborator and my dear friend Friedrich Willeburtze is a hardline atheist. And I'm a believer. But we agree on every single line we wrote on science. That was an enlightening experience for me. Not a single line we disagreed. We completely differ philosophically. So science is a very interesting project. It's far from obvious what is science. So I won't delve in what is science. I have a lot to tell you about the world also which science unveils. So just I want to make an observation here that although we are saying we are empirical, does it mean the invisible domains are ruled out by the empirical method? The answer is no. What experiment does is to provide you indirect evidence of what exists. I'll give you a simple example. Can anyone see your thoughts? Impossible. No one can see anyone's thoughts. But your actions will tell me this person's thinking being. He went there, he picked up the glass of water, he drank it. Maybe it's a robot. So more complex operation, I'll then deduce that you have consciousness. But you can't see consciousness. That's obvious. But you have a body that can be seen. So, what exists and doesn't exist is a very complex question. Evidence, indirect evidence, is all science provides. You can't see most of the stuff I will discuss. In fact, what I'll discuss, nothing of it you can see. But that's the foundation of the entire universe. And let me show you that. So here's the book, and I want to go through this slowly. Mr. Tauhid Samad told me, don't worry about the time. So I will not rush. Normally I have this cutoff, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, I'll be rushing. So if I see you're getting bored, I may accelerate. But let me go through this slowly to show you that this book cannot be discussed in any storyline manner, because you look at the topics we have. Galaxies. First is fields. So most people have never heard of fields. What's a field? Not the green field, or not your field where cows are grazing. Of course, that's called a field also, but that's not the field of physics. Field is a central template, the underlying theoretical structure for all of modern physics. Fields is it. So what's a field? I will discuss that briefly, opening. Then I have these three streams and finally unification here. This book is very carefully structured. So to understand this book, obviously you have to make an effort. It's not going to be a walk in the park. You have to make the effort to understand this book. So if I start fields, space, gravity, black holes. One stream. The black holes, cosmology, dark universe. It logically follows. Another stream, galaxies, stars, and elements. For example, how do galaxies form? How big can a galaxy be? We know the galaxy's maximum size is about 3 trillion stars. Why 3 trillion stars? Which are these galaxies? Our galaxy has 100 billion stars. How do these galaxies form? And by the way, we have actually measured experimentally more than 100 billion galaxies. There's no end to it. The universe is mind-bogglingly big and staggeringly big. But you can't see it. It has to be deduced from those faint glimmers of light you see in the night sky. Then, of course, galaxies are composed of stars. So we go and look at the stars. What's a star? How does it burn? What's its lifetime? What fuels it? What is the final destination of a star? What becomes of a star when it, say, exhausts its fuel? Of course, there's a vast amount of literature there. Elements is to show you every single atom in this room was produced in the solar furnace, was created in the core of a star, but the process of nuclear fusion. So then you can ask, well, can you predict the distribution of all the elements in the universe? The answer is yes. We can predict the relative abundance of all the elements, based on the nuclear processes in the core of stars producing these elements. So we go through the entire periodic table in the book, showing you how you produce elements. Like, you know, up till iron, you produce the normal stars. More than iron, you have to have supernova to produce it. Then you have collisions of neutron stars producing gold. So all kinds of mind-boggling things are going on. You can ask, why is gold so rare? Because it's not produced in a normal star. Only in neutron stars, which exploding stars, produce things like gold. So we analyze all the spectrum of the existing universe for the distribution of the atoms. The universe is 98% hydrogen, helium, 2% of heavy elements. That's all. But 2% makes all of us up here. Then go back to space. What is space anyway? We walk around space. Have you reflected what is space? The fundamental issue. What is space? So we discuss space. And then, of course, curved manifolds. What's a curved space? Because geometry and gravity are basically, in Einstein's view, identical. So we discuss gravity. Then, of course, in gravity and curvature, you would like to see what is there, which Newton doesn't have. And those are black holes. These are geometrical singularity. Singularity means that curvature goes to infinity when you hit a black hole. So then we discuss cosmology and the dark universe. Dark universe is forms of energy which are not ordinary matter. Then we go to the ultra-microscopic world, inside the nucleus, inside the quark, inside the core of matter right here. What is this thing made out of? Well, that's quarks and gluons and leptons and gauge fields and Higgs boson. In fact, I gave a long talk on the Higgs boson, which was discovered a few years back. So interaction, standard model. Okay, then this superstring unification is really at the very frontiers of physics, because this has not been verified by experiment. It's a massive theoretical structure which attempts to unify all of reality into a single entity. Whether this will be verified by experiments is an open question, but it addresses certain theoretical conundrums which have to be solved to make physics self-consistent. So I do that. Okay, so now you can see, to navigate through these topics is not going to be smooth because they are completely different in terms of their ruling paradigm. So I propose the following. So the book is essentially a comprehensive exposition written in a non-technical manner of the leading ideas of theoretical physics. It summarizes what we know today. So you may ask, well, why would you do a thing like this? Well, you know, primarily because we enjoy it, okay? That's the bottom line, okay? Because it's great fun doing it, okay? But also because you get a chance to express all of this in your own language. And something else, you know, which I was telling Mr. Tohi Samad, you know, when I wrote this book, the division of labor between me and my colleague was that, you know, I wrote the text, he made all the diagrams. But he read the text and clarified the text because he said, this is not clear, that is not clear. But my guiding principle in writing a text is talk straight to the point. Don't beat around the bush. Because the moment you beat around the bush, you're not clear what you're talking about. Then don't say things you're not clear about. Straight to the point. But the language being used in the book is like mathematics. It's English, but it's being used in a very, very technical way. So even if you read a non-technical book on science, you have to really understand what is being said. It's not about English language. It's about the concept that is being discussed. So here, this is how we wrote the book. The chapters, as I mentioned, discuss vastly different topics. So the problem with a book like this is that each chapter is a subfield of physics by itself. You know, galaxy formation is a huge part of astrophysics. Nuclear astrophysics linked to stellar fusion is stellar nuclear astrophysics, which is a vast subject. And, you know, particle physics is a vast subject by itself. So each subject has its own ruling paradigm that you have to make effort to understand. So I'm basically foregrounding the book to you. How should I navigate this talk? So the way I'm going to navigate this talk is to first tell you, don't expect each slide to be coherent with the previous one. It's not a storyline which will run through. Each slide can be standalone, and then that's over. So I will explain that specific thing, then I will move on. So then in that manner, you may miss a few slides, doesn't matter. Okay, I'm just trying to show you subject by subject, what is the leading idea and what is the thing invisible about, what is it that is invisible about the universe, because everything looks very visible here. What is invisible? So slowly I'll unpack that for you. So now let me start with the real stuff, okay? Fields. Fields is the form of nature. So you must understand, what do you mean by form? Form is the manner in which a thing appears. So every one of you is the form of a human being. That's how a human being appears. You have a form. What's the substance? What's the essence of the form? Is energy. So in physics, energy. The universe is made from energy. Everything is a manifestation of this essence, energy. You can ask, well, what is energy? To quote Richard Feynman, we don't know what's energy. All we know is a certain manner of expressing itself, certain manner of manifestation. That's all we know. And it turns out, as of now, all manifestations of energy are fields. You can tell me, well, you still haven't told me what a field is. What is a field? I'll give you an example. I mean, this light here is a field, the electromagnetic field in the room. So you know what a field is intuitively. But all physical reality is a collection of fields. And there are fundamental fields and non-fundamental fields. Non-fundamental fields I will not discuss at all. Fundamental fields is all I'm interested in. So study of physics is a study of fields. That's what it is. The defining property of a field is that energy and momentum are spread out over space and time. Spread out. They're not. See, if you throw a particle, energy is carried by the particle, energy is sticking to the particle. But for a field, energy is spread throughout space and time. So let me give you an idea of the field, which you have probably seen. A magnet is a magnetic field. The two electric charges, electric field. A lightning is a propagating electromagnetic field. In this room, the room is full of the electromagnetic field being energized. Why can you see anything in the light? Because the light from the bulb bounces off the wall and comes to your eye. So what do you mean by bounces? To a point, the entire room has a density of energy because you switched on the light. If you switch it off, it's zero. So the field has dispersed energy throughout space-time. And if you create oscillations in the field, this oscillation can propagate, and we call it a wave or radiation. So here's the lightning. The electromagnetic field propagates, which means causes oscillations in the energy, which then can be seen by your eye if you capture the energy. So field permeates all of space-time. Every single point of the universe has a field. Let's take this humble electromagnetic field. I'm saying humble because the other fields are much more complex and much more massive. This humble field, the electromagnetic field, is throughout the universe the same field. The galaxy 6 billion light years from here, the plant absorbing photon, I'm switching on this laser point, it's the same field. The same field is being excited. It's one entity throughout the universe, fundamental field. So there are a bunch of fields in nature, and these fields constitute what is nature. So then you have to study the nature of the field. What is the field? What is it doing? What is it made out of? What are the properties of the field? So let me go to that slowly. Before I move on, I want to just point something else out here. A classical field. Classical is just a code word for reminding you that in this room, a classical field means that if I measure the electric field at this point, it has a specific value. It has a value, okay? That's all. Later on, I'll return to this idea with a quantum field, which is much more complex, okay? But the classical field has a definite value at every, so in this room, at any point you make a measurement, classically you'll see, okay, electric field is so-and-so, magnetic field so-and-so. Fix it. So this is a representation of that position which means you move around the room. This is the value of the field at different points of the room. Just remember this, and this is the example. The electromagnetic field is a fundamental field. Okay, we're in good shape. Now we have to come to Einstein, right? Einstein said gravity is curved geometry. So this is a loaded statement. You may say, what do you mean by this? Curved geometry, gravity, I mean, what's going on? First, let me give you an idea of what is geometry to show you that this is something you see every day. Let's take the cities of the earth. So you have the cities of the earth. You say, well, I know the distance between, say, Dhaka and say, Kolkata, Dhaka, and, say, Beijing, Dhaka, and Singapore. I will place the cities on a piece of paper so that the distances between cities is what I have measured by traveling around the world. So I said, fine, let's do that. So when you do that, you discover whatever you do on a piece of paper, the same city will appear at two different points. Here, Mauritius appearing 2 different points. Means what? You can't fit the cities on the plane. Whatever you do, if you put distances as measured and you place the cities on a piece of paper, you can never make the distances come out consistently. Why? Because the cities live on a sphere. You don't live on a plane. You discover this by basically taking a table of all distances between 2 points, and you say, I'll place the points, in this case, on a piece of paper. To make them consistent, you discover whatever I do, I'm failing. Then you say, well, maybe I should not place them on a piece of paper, maybe I should place them on a sphere. On a sphere, perfect. Mauritius comes out as a single point. Here, Mauritius is split between the same thing appears at 2 points, which is inconsistent because Mauritius distance from itself is 0. Can't appear at 2 different points. So geometry is the distance between any 2 points. If you give me all distances, I'll create for you what is called a curved manifold. All the points will be arranged in a way which is consistent with their distance. So here is an example of geometry that you've seen. A sphere, which is a very, very complex object. A sphere looks very simple. If you study a sphere, it has tremendous structure which on first sight you do not capture. For example, you draw a triangle on the sphere. The sum is not 180 degrees, which we always say for normal Euclidean geometry, because that's drawn on a plane. Here, these add up to much bigger than 180 degrees. They can add up to even 270 degrees if you draw them with the geodesics and all that. But mainly, you can see these angles don't add up to 180 degrees. So geometry is essentially the shape of a collection of points. So what's this got to do with anything? Well, Einstein said, look, there is no such thing as gravity. Space-time is curved. And the reflection of curvature is you think you are attracting each other. Like Newton said, you know, famous thing, the apple fell to the earth because the earth attracted the apple due to gravity. That's the old Newton. Now we're saying, no, Newton is wrong. There's no attraction between anyone. Earth is going on a certain trajectory because of gravity, of curvature of space-time, and so is the apple. And they happen to meet. Okay, I won't spend too much time on that. And let me talk of something which are more interesting, because if I talk of geometry, it's a bit mathematical. Okay, so here's Einstein. Einstein's gravity is a classical field. So I want to connect you back to the idea of field. So we're doing a classical field. It's a very complex field. It's called field of geometry. Still a classical field. Now here is this interesting things of Einstein. Gravity can slow down the flow of time. And the whole of Interstellar was a play on that. That only gravity can slow down time. So the question you can ask is that, can gravity stop the flow of time? And the answer is yes. And I'll answer that in the next slide. So what does this mean, slowing down time? You're doing it every day, you don't realize it. When you have GPS, you have satellites which is in orbit around the Earth, which is far from the Earth, maybe a few hundred kilometers. So if you compare 2 clocks, one on the Earth's surface, one, say, a kilometer above this clock, then this clock is running, compared to this clock, a bit slower. In other words, the closer you are to a gravitating body, the slower your clock runs. The further you are, faster it runs. Now, both clocks are perfect, but when you compare them, one looks slower and the other looks faster. So this is a little cartoon saying, you know, you're running fast, he's saying, no, you're running slow. Both are right, because when they compare it, of course, he claims he's fast, he claims he's slow. He's slow because he's near the gravitating Earth. So near gravitating body, time slows down. So you can ask, can I have enough gravitation to stop the flow of time? And the answer is yes. And that's why I included this black hole here, because black hole is a very complex mathematical object. But it also exists in nature. That's the interesting part. Now this diagram, you know, I was debating whether I should unpack this diagram for you. Okay, this diagram, okay, what does this mean? Okay, these little, you know, light cones I've drawn. Let me go through this slowly with you. So here is the black hole. The black hole is sitting here. It's propagating in time. This is time, this is space. The black hole is propagating in time, okay? Now, distant observer means that I'm seeing the black hole from far away. So the black hole is, say, 1 million light years from me. Far away, what I do, I put observers all over space-time. And I ask them, how fast is your clock running compared to me? Then you discover, compared to my clock, as I approach the surface of the black hole, surface is the horizon, which I'll come back in a minute, the clock apparently slows down, and then the clock stops running at the horizon, completely stops, no movement, no time. Even light, which is traveling at the speed of light, if you look at it from close by, if you examine light from a distance, at the horizon, light has stopped to move. Light is trapped on the surface. There's no movement going on at all on the surface of the black hole. Time has come to a halt here, completely. So you may ask, you're standing far away. What happens if I fall into the black hole? Will I see something different? Answer is yes. With a caveat, when you fall in, you can never communicate what you see to the person who is not falling in. If you fall in, you can see inside the black hole. So the horizon is some distance. This is the horizon. If you fall in, so this means the following. If I'm falling in, I have a ray of light going away from the black hole, a ray of light going in the black hole. So as you can see, as I approach the horizon, the guy going away is slowly squeezed until he's on the black hole horizon. He can't get away. So this is what the light cones show you, that if I'm trying to look at this light going away from the black hole. As I approach the black hole, I am locked into basically away and towards the black hole become the same. The light cone has collapsed. It's become a line. No movement of light. Light supposedly moves at the speed of light always. Yes, if you are sitting where the light is, but if you're looking at light from a far away distance, the black hole slows down light for your frame. But if you fall in, so this light is going away from the black hole, you look at it, it tilts like the guy going away from the black hole is trapped on the horizon. Now all light, even going away from the horizon, still tilts. Finally, everything crashes into the black hole. Here, you are crushed out of existence because at this point, the curvature of space-time is infinite. So that's why it's called a singularity. Singularity means the curvature of space-time is infinite. So anything approaching the singularity will be torn to shreds by the singularity. So two frames of reference. The one outside the black hole sees only horizon, and then there's a hole where nothing comes out, nothing goes in. That's the black hole. Had a finite radius. For mass m, the radius of the black hole is some number. So you have this hole in space, and that's it. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out. But if you want to fall into the black hole, then you will see the singularity. And of course, you'll be crushed. And you can't communicate what you're seeing to the one who is beyond. So the interior of the black hole is completely invisible to you. For distant observer, you can never see the interior of a black hole, but your mathematical structure tells you, well, I'm getting signals, there's something inside there. If I have the equation, then I can even tell you what is happening at the horizon, what's happening when the guy falls in. I can send electron inside, he'll radiate some stuff to me, I'll measure, I'll say, look, this radiation tells you my mathematics of the black hole is correct. And this is being observed all the time. In astrophysics, X-ray radiation comes out from objects falling into the black hole, standard item. So construction is very exotic. You can't enter the black hole. That is forbidden for you. That's completely in the beyond. You're absolutely forbidden from entering it. If you enter it, you're destroyed. So you see the singularity, then you're gone. Now, there's some staggering objects in the universe, quasars. These are gigantic objects having a mass more than 2-3 billion solar masses, spinning almost at the speed of light. And they're pumping out energy which is like 100,000, few million times more than our galaxy. They're so energetic. They're called active galactic nuclei. They are massive black holes spinning, and all sorts of things are happening around it. I won't go into the details, but all I'm trying to say is that they're well-studied mathematical objects, and They experimentally been detected and have been analyzed. In our own galaxy, the Milky Way, we also have a huge 3 million solar masses black hole at the center of our galaxy spinning also. It's not a quasar, it's quiescent. Quasars are very active and very dynamic object. Apparently, they are created at the Big Bang singularity. Later on, they apparently all quietened down. So quasars are very far away, like 5 or 6 billion light years. But the one we have in our galaxy is already 3 million solar masses, gigantic object. So these objects all are there, very interesting. Now gravity slows down time and curvature comes in. That gravity also can bend light. Light follows the shortest path between 2 points. So if you say you want to go from here to say the North Pole, on the surface you'll have the shortest path is a latitude. You can go around any way you want, but you want to get there, it's the shortest way. There is a specific path where we just call it a geodesic. Light follows a specific path. Now here what you see is the following. If I have a distant object, say a quasar 1.5 billion light years away, the light is being curved by the gravitating field of a nearby galaxy, say 150 million light years. So what you will see are images which are virtual, they're not really there. This is curvature of light creates an image, and so you will see basically a lensing effect. This is called gravitational lensing. An ordinary lens just focuses your light when you have, say, glasses you wear. It's lensing. This is lensing at a cosmic scale. You see many objects. So this lensing is a brilliant way of measuring the mass of this galaxy, because the lensing will be depending on how massive is that intermediate galaxy doing the curving of space-time. So this I will use to show you something which is also of great interest. We talk about dark energy, dark universe, dark matter. Dark matter and dark energy are different objects. Dark matter is matter which is clumped around galaxies. Dark energy is energy spread throughout the universe. Two different objects, okay? Here is a mind-boggling picture which I show my students. You say, well, this is blue and red. What's going on? There is a collision of two galaxies involving almost 1 trillion stars. So they collided. So when they collided, ordinary matter scatters off. Scatter means ordinary matter resists movement of objects going through, but dark matter couples very lightly to gravity. Dark matter just slides through the galaxy. So this object, blue object, came from this galaxy, this blue from this object, they simply slipped through. So this is dark matter, ordinary matter. Ordinary matter you can verify using optical and other telescopes. Dark matter by lensing. So here is evidence of dark matter at this kind of galactic cosmic scale. Dark matter exists. Now, you know, a lot of people say this is all imagination, you guys are making it up. You know, this is all very serious business with billions of dollars and thousands of hours spent creating these experiments. There's not some hallucination going on. So if you want to question the scientific enterprise, of course, you know, that's a different issue. I can show you thousands of bits of information to convince you this is all happening. It's not some concoction. So dark matter definitely exists. Dark energy is interesting. If dark energy exists, then distant galaxies have two options. If there's no dark energy, it will be here. If dark energy, there'll be some kind of accelerated expansion of the universe. And again, observations tell us there is also dark energy in the universe. So dark energy, dark matter, quite popular. Just a small take. Cosmology is a vast subject. I'll just spend one diagram on it because, you know, I have no time. So here is the entire cosmology. The universe starts with a huge singularity. Singularity meaning curvature is infinite, energy density infinite, temperature infinite, everything infinite. And then you have big explosion. And then you have essentially stages of the evolution of the universe. First is inflation. Suddenly, it's like you take a piece of rubber and you stretch it trillions of times. So any irregularities in rubber will be stretched out to being flat. The universe at the large scale is almost exactly flat. A big paradox why. So inflation explains that, saying the stretching of space-time creates an almost exactly flat universe. And then, of course, you have galaxy formation. Then you have, because of dark energy, the expansion accelerates. So this is just a summary of huge amounts of information. But I want to show you this diagram. This diagram may seem to be obscure, but it's a very interesting diagram. Look at this carefully. It says the number density of ordinary matter compared to the density of photons. So this is a number which can vary. The universe has a specific value for this. So in the equation, you have a parameter, the density of ordinary matter. You vary it. Then you have the abundance of these light nuclei, helium, deuterium, helium. These can only be produced in the Big Bang. They can't be produced in normal stellar fusion. So then you ask, okay, I have this observed value of the number density. What is the prediction of theory? These are lines. And you see this amazing agreement of the theoretical prediction with the observed result. Helium, lithium, deuterium exactly fall on the points that your theory predicts. So this is one proof. There are 3 or 4 proofs that Big Bang actually happened. So just a brief summary of that. So now the Big Bang has happened. So now the question is, how do galaxies form? The key to galaxy formation is that this primordial cloud that comes out from the Big Bang is very hot. So there has to be a mechanism to cool this primordial interstellar gas. So if there's a mechanism of cooling the gas, galaxies form. If the gas can't cool, the dust disperses and disperses. So galaxies form with a huge computation to show galaxies can form, and then of course the computation showed the biggest galaxies can have about 2 trillion stars, not more. Galaxies typically have 100 to 1,000 billion stars, 100 to 1 trillion stars. Our galaxy has 100 billion stars. All stars were initially composed of hydrogen and helium because that comes out from the Big Bang. So I was telling this to Mr. Tohi Samad that, stars are burning. So he said, they're burning, there's no oxygen there. How are they burning? I said, well, they're not burning oxygen, they're doing nuclear fusion. So this formula that you have seen many times, E equal to mc square, is the foundation for the burning of all the stars in the entire universe. All stellar fusion is essentially this formula, this tiny, well-known formula, but applied at a cosmic scale. For example, our sun converts per second 4.3 tons of hydrogen into pure radiation. That's all. So you can imagine how much energy is in this 4.3 tons. The entire burning of the sun is simply this amount per second. And you can compute from here, the sun has been burning for 5 billion years, another 5 billion years it will burn, and then you can ask, well, what happens finally to a star? Does it keep burning forever? If it runs out of fuel, what happens to it? Interesting question. We answer that also. So the question is, what is the final destination of stars when they exhaust their energy? Which means they've used up all the fuel that is powering their burning. The 3 final destinations for a star. So here's the primordial nebula, the gas which comes out from the Big Bang. This is our typical star. Our star is 1 solar mass. This star becomes a red giant, becomes a white dwarf. White dwarf basically is an inactive dead star. There's nothing happening there. If the initial star is very massive, essentially having more than 8 times the mass of our sun, then it has 2 options. It has a supernova, which means the star explodes. Why? Because it keeps on burning. The gravity is so strong that when it exhausts the fuel, the gravity causes the whole object to collapse under the force of gravity. And that collapsing of the star converts gravitational energy into fusion, creating all the heavy elements like uranium, plutonium, gold. They're all created in the supernova. And then supernova has 2 choices, depending on the mass. Either become the neutron star or a spinning black hole. So all stars finally have this as their destination: white dwarf, neutron star, or black hole. So we spend a lot of time actually analyzing how each step in this process takes place. And then we also show the entire distribution of all the elements in the universe can be predicted based on the theories of nuclear astrophysics and astrophysics, gravity. So this is what we produce, the entire distribution of all elements based on the theories of physics. Solar system is very useful for us because we live in a solar system. Just pay attention to this one. Supernova looks like a distant event. Who cares? Supernova happened, didn't happen. Do we really, are we interested? The answer is yes, because our formation of our planets and our solar system was triggered by a supernova explosion 5 billion years ago. 5 billion years ago, there was an explosion. You may say, well, how do you know this? What evidence do you have? A lot of evidence. There's chondrites and there's silica and there's all kinds of elements which can only appear in the galactic dust based on a supernova explosion. Otherwise, they can never appear. So we can look at meteors, we can look at the dust we have, we can look at the star, our star, sun, and we can deduce this event happened. This event was fundamental because this event created shock waves which collapsed the interstellar gas, created this solar nebula, this swirling gas, which finally coalesced into the sun at the core and planets revolving around it. The planets are very interesting also. They're the rocky planets and the icy planets, the gaseous planets. You may wonder why at Mars do the rocky planets end? The reason is very simple. After Mars, up till Mars, the radiation of the sun is completely blowing off all water vapor, all gas is being evaporated by the power of the sun's radiation. After the ice line, the line after which ice can form, all gaseous planets, Jupiter, Saturn, they all form gaseous planets, massive ones. Something else also about the sun which is very peculiar. The sun, because of Jupiter and the sun, all small objects in the solar system are basically scattered out. So the solar system is cleaned up and preserved for billions of years, free from all big collisions, because Sun and Jupiter are two massive bodies. So the system of planets has tremendous structure, okay, tremendous structure. Some have magnetic fields, some don't have magnetic field, very important also. So that we discuss also in our book. So that now we are done with astrophysics. Now we want to go to the core of matter, right? What makes up this table? What makes up this chair? What makes up your body? What is an atom? So the long story, I'm going to summarize whole books into one slide. So here is the quantum field, okay? The quantum field is the backbone of theoretical physics. The quantum field is the last word in theoretical physics, okay? This is it. So why is it the last word? Because in a very fundamental way, a quantum field, look at this diagram. It looks like the classical field I showed you, but you must look at it a bit carefully. Position here has many values for the field. Why? Because the field is indeterminate. So you can ask, what do you mean by indeterminate? What do you mean by this? From the quantum principle states, if you don't perform a measurement, the entity has many possibilities existing simultaneously. And to put it very crudely, so if you don't perform a measurement, the entity has many possibilities coexisting simultaneously. So let me give you an example. Suppose you are in this room and no one performs a measurement. Quantum mechanics is saying you, single entity, are at every point of the room at the same time. It sounds absurd. Then you say, well, can you show me he's everywhere? I said, no. The moment you make a measurement, you'll find him at a specific chair. So you can say, well, then you're cheating because, you know, I always find him at the same place. I said, no, it won't be same place. You perform measurement, you'll find him with a certain probability being at different points in the room. And that's the indirect evidence, the state, when you don't measure it, is indeterminate. So that requires a whole discussion on quantum mechanics, but I state this because we explain nature using this indeterminate quantum field. Now, you know, if you see a lizard walking on the roof, on the wall, he's using the properties of a quantum field. That's how real is the quantum field. The gecko is using at the nanoscale. He has scales, he has hair which are down to the size of a nanometer. At that minute scale, he has many, many hairs on his feet. They basically interact with the wall and create an attractive force, so you can walk on the wall, you can walk on the roof. So the quantum field is very real. The field is indeterminate. So here you have this gamma simply means light, electromagnetic radiation. It can create pairs of particles from the vacuum, which can never happen through a classical field. Okay, so it's quantum field. So now using the quantum field, I can describe to you how matter is constituted. What is matter? Matter has two aspects: the matter which carries mass and the matter which is the interaction between these masses. So here is the part which is massive, quarks and leptons. So before coming to this, let me show you where these guys live. So you take a piece of steel and you keep on breaking it up. When you go down to the level of the atoms, you'll find that the atoms are arranged in a lattice, perfectly regular. Now you enter the atom. The atom is electrons spinning around a nucleus. When I say spinning, you must think of this as metaphorical, because these are all quantum particles. They're not spinning, doing anything. They are basically indeterminate. Electron indeterminate, so is the nucleus. But crudely speaking, let's probe the structure. So you find atom is electrons and nuclei. The nucleus is protons and neutrons. Each of this proton, neutron is further composed of quarks. Now you may say, okay, that's great, quarks. Well, show me a quark. The peculiar thing about quarks is that they can never come outside the nucleus. They're permanently confined to be inside the nucleus forever. That's another paradox. They exist, but you cannot see them directly. You can have indirect evidence, but not directly. How do I know that this is true? Quarks exist? Well, you know, one can show that the proton is made out of 3 quarks, up, down. Up, up, down. Neutron also 3 quarks, but slight difference is up, down, down. That's the only difference. 1 quark has been switched from up to down. So each of these nuclei composed of protons and neutrons are simply a collection of quarks who are also fundamental particles, point-like, but you can't see them. You can have indirect evidence, but you can't isolate them like an electron. Electron, luckily, is a very friendly object. You can see the electron in some sense by basically, if you heat an atom, the electrons come out easily. Quarks can never come out from the nucleus. So here's the diagram for how quarks are classified. I won't go into that. Here's the interaction, how the things interact with each other. I will not belabor this point, but you see a neutron can become a proton if you can switch a down quark to an up quark. So this has charge -1/3, this has charge 2/3. So to conserve charge, he has to emit a particle with -1 charge, and this is the famous W boson, for which Salam and others got a Nobel Prize. This is the weak interaction. They discovered that there are particles which carry charge, which are like the photon, which like light, but they are much more complex because they have charge. You know, light doesn't carry charge, light is neutral. But these interactions carry charge, and then they can dissipate. Neutron, and then of course you have the residual particles coming from the interaction. So this is how interactions are described inside the nucleus and outside the nucleus. Proton is very different. Proton is 3 quarks, but they combine with these strongly interacting fields which look like they're objects which are basically string-like objects. Coming back to the theme of this whole thing of visible, invisible, there are 4 fundamental forces. Most of the invisible. The only thing you can probably see slightly is the part which is visible, electromagnetic radiation. Of that also, what you see, the small sliver, right? When you do an X-ray, you don't see the X-ray. It's too small for your eye. When you do a microwave in your microwave oven, you don't see the microwave. You just see it heating up objects. So even what you see of electromagnetism is a very tiny, thin slice of what the whole spectrum is. So most fundamental interactions are invisible, can only be inferred from the observations we make. This is the big picture. Here is the cosmic DNA. after 2,000 years of atomic picture, it was solved basically with the discovery of the Higgs boson. This is all of the fundamental particles that exist in nature. This is the cosmic DNA. Everything that we see around us and a lot which we don't see around us are here. So the final tableau is quite compact. I mean, the entire universe can be reduced to this. Is a landmark achievement for the human intellect, right? That this is the template of nature. And here's a detector to show you a small human being standing here. This detector at CERN cost, billions of euros and was used to detect the Higgs boson. And of course, they're still trying to find new objects. The journey has not ended. I just made aside here triumph of quantum field theory because all of these objects are quantum fields. Each object here has a quantum field which is represented by a symbol here. So each of them has a quantum, so many quantum fields interacting with each other and essentially giving you the world you see. Okay, so this is a summary of what we know. Now I thought I'll include superstrings to let you know that physics doesn't stop at just, what's the word, at any point. It's always more. So you may say, what is more? You have gravity, you have particles, you've done everything. What's left? Well, one is never satisfied. Here are two problems that we have. One problem is that Einstein's gravity, the classical theory, is in conflict with quantum mechanics, which is indeterminate. So we must make Einstein's gravity indeterminate. The other thing we're not happy with is that the 25 fermion, 11 bosons in that cosmic DNA I showed you, and there are 26 free parameters. We want a theory which has one entity and no free parameters. That's the dream, that everything comes out self-consistently. Maybe expecting too much, but that's the hope, okay? So how do we do that? Well, one candidate is superstring theory. This is why I thought it's worthwhile for me to spend some time on superstring theory. Now, so far, there's not a single piece of data which contradicts the existing paradigms of physics. Standard model, Einstein's gravity work perfectly. So you may say, well, then what are you trying to answer? So what we're answering is not a conflict of theory with experiment, which is the way things worked in the past. What we're trying to do is to answer a theoretical conflict between the quantum principle and Einstein's theory, plus our expectation that we want to reduce the number of fundamental particles. Too many. 25 plus 16, too many. And the reason I thought I'd include this in the talk here is because superstring is at the frontier of science, and it shows that physics is all the time developing deeper conceptions of nature. It never stops. I'm sure if we go forward, there'll be more and more stuff coming out. Although, the amount we know is already staggering. It's like we almost know everything, but I think there's more. Superstrings, I'll go through this very briefly. A superstring is, as you imagine, a string, but already it's peculiar. This can only exist in higher dimensions. A string cannot exist in 3 space at one time, not allowed by quantum mechanics. It has to be 10 dimensions or higher. So immediately you have the mathematics of 10, of 11 or 12 dimensional space-time. Basic structure, basic platform in which things are happening. So the string propagates in time. It spans out a sheet. If it's a closed string, it spans out a cylinder. Then you may say, well, you want only string existing. How can you have interactions? There has to be something outside the string. Answer is no. The string can propagate, can fission, and it can fuse. So these holes that you see are non-linearities of string. String is interacting with itself. Same with the closed string. You come here, you can fission and fuse again. So string is interacting with itself and creating this non-linearity, which of course is at the center of all interesting things. The unification here is very interesting. Unification here is the following, that if you take, say, a violin string and you pluck it, you have different harmonics which come out. So in the string picture, the vibration of the string, each vibration corresponds to a particle that we call a quantum field. So essentially, you don't have more particles, you have a new object whose oscillations are what are the fundamental particles of nature, the standard model. So that's how you unify everything together, not by just putting more and more stuff into the bag of tricks you have, but a new object you have whose oscillations are the particles you consider to be distinct. So the photon, the light particle you see, and this thing made out of electrons are the same, they're strings, just that this looks like light and this looks like a particle, because the oscillation is different. So unifies everything, that's the good news for us. Now I want to, so we are in 10-dimensional universe now, huge. So where are we? Well, we have two choices in superstring theory. This extra dimensions can be small, which means that, say, let's take for example 10 dimensions, okay? So space is 9 dimensions and there's one time. So in this room, it's 3-dimensional, right? You look at the corner of the room, you have 3 axes which tell you height and length and breadth to put a point here, right? So at every point in this room, we imagine there's an internal space of 6 dimensions. The whole universe is right here, very small, you can't see it. And if you put this little bubble at every point in the room, you get a 9-dimensional manifold. And then you have time, which makes it 10. So one picture is that extra dimensions are small. The other picture, which I find more exciting, is that all the dimensions are big, but we are a slice of this higher dimension. That's much more exciting. So to illustrate it for you, how do you make higher dimensions? You take a book. Book is what pages. Each page is 2-dimensional. You stack up the 2 dimensions, you get 3 dimensions. So you can imagine, if you have a 5-dimensional space-time, each slice is our universe. So they have infinitely many of our universes stacked up to make a 5-dimensional universe. And then infinitely many of that stacked up to make a 6-dimensional universe. And stacking up to make a 10-dimensional universe. So you have huge, vast space there. So I indicate that here, that suppose this is our universe, this looks like a line embedded in a universe which is in green, which is itself not covering the entire universe. So you can have a 7-dimensional universe, you can have a 6D universe, you can have a 5D universe. So one picture that we are small slice here, but superstring theory allows higher dimensional universes to exist. 6, 7, 8, 9-dimensional universes to exist. And then of course you can have objects in that universe. So it opens up a whole different view of what our universe consists of. This is nothing. It's just a tiny slice of what can exist. Whether it does or not, question of experiment. I think this one I'll just rush by. This is a bit too complex. There's a superstring construction of black holes, which I'll not discuss. Here, it's an interesting idea that the dark matter that we talked about, which is linked to our visible galaxies, is thought to be the result of extra-dimensional matter, which is then having gravitational attraction with the part of our universe. So you have extra dimensions. From here, you have gravitating particles, closed strings come to you and create this dark matter that you observe in the lab. So this part I'll skip. This is a bit too complicated. This slide I put in after a lot of hesitation because in the Big Bang, remember, I kept saying that the universe started off, say, 13.8 billion years ago with the infinite singularity, high temperature, infinite curvature, and all that. So then a lot of people said, well, what happened before the Big Bang? And the answer was, Einstein's theory of gravity can't answer that. Einstein's theory of gravity ends with the singularity. You can't go past it. But in superstring theories, in something called M theory, you have an 11-dimensional universe, and there the following picture is mathematically consistent. I'm not saying it's true. Consistent, which is the following. You have 2 universes. One is ours, and we have a companion universe. Once in a trillion years, these 2 guys collide and separate. And it's been going on forever. So this has no beginning and no end. It's an endless universe. Hence, the Big Bang need not be the beginning of space-time. That's a model-dependent answer. This is also a model, but the model shows you that there's much more than that has been possible before superstring because of the vast mathematics we have with superstring. Okay, so that's quickly. So summarizing, I think I've taken more time than I expected, but I'm still okay. Yeah, I took your watch as well. But it will be returned to you. The time will be given back. So, big journey, just to give you a glimpse, a lot of stuff going on. If you're interested, the book I'm going to give at the library, IUB, you can study it. So, I was discussing the universe with a friend. He said, yeah, human being, speck of dust, you're nothing. Whatever you say, look at this vast universe, look at the skies, millions of stars and billions of galaxies. I said, yeah, Man, compared to the universe, is a speck of dust. I agree. But this speck of dust can conceive and experimentally confirm a universe at least many billions of years old. Can conceive of galaxies, can conceive of black hole, billions of solar masses. So the human mind can conceive and provide evidence of point-like quarks which are confined inside the nucleus. You can never enter that. But your mind has gone there, made a mathematical model. Based on that, we come out, we scatter things off the proton, we confirm, yes, there are quarks inside, which can never come out. Done by the human mind. Can construct this magnificent structure of superstring theory, 10 dimensions, 11 dimensions, and objects in that dimension. So yes, human beings are specks of dust, but how do we see the invisible universe? It's our theoretical consciousness that conceives the cosmos, and based on our mathematics, we experimentally, indirectly perceive this vast domain of an otherwise invisible universe. So my personal view, yes, human beings are indeed specks of dust, but no ordinary speck of dust. This speck of dust can generate the immense, vast, and complex scientific conception of the universe and more. And in my view, this is possible because our consciousness seems to be as vast as the universe itself. Our consciousness is the universe. Without this, you can't see anything. So, in case we get carried away that we are great, yes, we are great, but not that great, because in the universe there are many galaxies. In my personal view, there are many alien beings, maybe having 7, 8-dimensional structure with God knows what kind of brains they will have, which have even higher consciousness. So, universe is vast, but the human mind seems to be equally vast. That's how it grasps this entire invisible universe. That's the lesson I got in studying and writing about the universe. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.